The roaring of jets overshadowed the crashing of the seas. They raced to the end of the runway, pulling up over the ocean with ease. Those left on the deck of the enormous aircraft carrier looked up, watching air traffic and breathing in the salty sea air. These beautiful ships were the peak of innovation during World War II, and have left a lasting mark on military life moving forward. Welcome to Fast Facts Friday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Aircraft carriers have a vast history, and there are many types of aircraft carriers. The earliest recorded instance of using a ship for air operations was in 1806, when Lord Cochrane of the Royal Navy launched kites from the frigate HMS Pallas to drop propaganda leaflets against Napoleon Bonaparte. Over 40 years later, on July 12, 1849, the Austrian Navy ship SMS Volcano launched incendiary balloons. A number of small Montgolfier hot air balloons were launched with the intention of dropping bombs on Venice, though this attempt largely failed due to winds blowing the balloons back toward the ship. However, one bomb was dropped on Venice. During the Peninsula Campaign in the American Civil War, gas-filled balloons were used to perform air reconnaissance on Confederate positions, though this was only useful for a short period as they could not fly into the heavily forested areas of the peninsula, where the battle shortly took to. USS George Washington Parke Custis, a coal barge, was cleared of deck rigging to accommodate gas generators and apparatus of balloons for launching them. Balloons being launched from ships led to the development of the balloon carrier during World War I, mostly by the navies of the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Russia, and Sweden. About 10 balloon carriers were built, with their main objective being aerial observation posts. These ships were either decommissioned or converted to seaplane tenders post-World War I. Speaking of which, seaplane carriers are next. Seaplanes were invented in March of 1910, and this led to the earliest iteration of the modern aircraft carrier. In December of 1911, the French Navy's Foudroy was the first seaplane carrier. These planes were carried in hangars on the main deck and were lowered into the sea with a crane where they would take off from there. HMS Hermes temporarily was converted into an experimental seaplane carrier from April to May of 1913. She'd flip-flop between armed merchant cruiser and seaplane carrier until her sinking in October of 1914. Not all was quiet on the Western Front, as the first naval air raid on December 25, 1914 rang out in the sky. 12 seaplanes launched from HMS Engadine, Riviera, and Empress, all cross-channel steamers converted into seaplane carriers, attacked the Zeppelin base at Cuxhaven. The attack was not a roaring success, however. A German warship was damaged, but the base was not entirely destroyed as originally intended. However, this display demonstrated the feasibility of attack by ship-borne aircraft and showed the strategic importance of this long before World War II. Many cruisers and capital ships of the interwar years often carried a catapult-launched seaplane for reconnaissance and spotting the fall of shot. These planes were launched by a catapult and recovered by crane from the water after landing. They were successful even during World War II. Moving on toward World War II, the development of heavier-than-air aircraft in the early 20th century led to various navies wanting to use them as scouts for their big-gun warships. In 1909, the French inventor Clément Ader published in his book L'Aviation Militaire the description of a ship to operate airplanes at sea, with a flat flight deck, an island superstructure, deck elevators, and a hangar bay. Sounds pretty familiar, right? Well, a number of experimental flights were made to test the concept. Eugene Ely was the first pilot to land from a stationary ship in November of 1910. He took off from a structure fixed over the forecastle of the U.S. armored cruiser USS Birmingham at Hampton Roads, Virginia, and landed on nearby Willoughby Spit after some 5 minutes in the air. On January 18, 1911, Ely became the first pilot to land on a stationary ship. He took off from the Tanforan racetrack and landed on a temporary structure on the aft of USS Pennsylvania in San Francisco. He's got a really interesting story, so if you want to learn more about Eugene Ely, let me know. Flat-deck carriers were seen in World War I, though less extensively than World War II. HMS Ark Royal was arguably the first active aircraft carrier, since she carried seaplanes for use in combat for military operations. HMS Furious was the first ship to be designed with the same basic features as modern aircraft carriers, as it was the first aircraft carrier to be equipped with a flight deck for airplanes, though its initial flight decks were in two portions and therefore not continuously full length with the ship. She'd be rebuilt with a full flight deck in 1925 and served in combat operations during World War II. She was the aircraft carrier that walked, so those from World War II could run. If you remember from our History of Cruisers video, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 placed great restrictions on the building of battleships and battlecruisers for all of the key players in World War I. However, there were no limits to aircraft carriers, so many battleships and battlecruisers under construction were converted to aircraft carriers. The first ship with a full-length flat deck was HMS Argus, the conversion of which was completed in September of 1918. Though the U.S. had the experimental conversion of USS Langley in 1920, the first fleet carriers would not enter service until November of 1927, when USS Saratoga of the Lexington class was commissioned. The lead ship of this class, USS Lexington, was commissioned the following month. Japan's Hosho was the first purpose-built aircraft carrier to be commissioned in December of 1922, though HMS Hermes was the first laid down in 1924, and also the first with an offset control tower. She was also the first with the Hurricane bow, which is a bow sealed up to the flight deck, and combat experience would prove this deck to be by far the most useful configuration for the bow of the ship among others that were tried. As we move into the 1930s, tensions in Europe grew to a fever pitch. And we are getting to a fever pitch in this episode. If you are enjoying this episode and want to hear more about ships, their careers, and their wrecks, check out our main show, Shipwreck Sunday, every Sunday night at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Alright, dear listeners, we are heading into World War II. Aircraft carriers played a huge role in World War II. The Royal Navy had a considerable numerical advantage at the start of World War II, as neither the Germans nor the Italians had carriers of their own. However, they were proven vulnerable compared to traditional battleships when forced into a gun-range encounter, and one prime example of this was the sinking of HMS Glorious by German battlecruisers during the Norwegian campaign in 1940. However, the versatility of carriers was also on full display in November of 1940. HMS Illustrious launched a long-range attack on the Italian fleet at the Battle of Toronto, and no, not Toronto, Canada. This signaled the beginning of effective mobile aircraft strikes by short-ranged aircraft. Carriers also played a major part in reinforcing Malta, both by transporting planes and defending convoys sent to supply the besieged island. This usage of carriers was instrumental in preventing the Italian Navy and land-based German aircraft from dominating the Mediterranean theater. In the Atlantic, aircraft launched from HMS Ark Royal and HMS Victorious were responsible for slowing down the German battleship Bismarck during May of 1941. Later in the war, escort carriers proved their weight in stones guarding convoys crossing the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. World War II in the Pacific theater involved numerous clashes between aircraft carrier fleets. Japan started off the war with 10 aircraft carriers, the largest and most modern carrier fleet in the world at the time. At the same time, there were 7 aircraft carriers in the U.S. fleet at the beginning of hostilities, although only 3 of them were operating in the Pacific. The attack of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 was a clear indication of how powerful aircraft launched from aircraft carriers were. They could cause major devastation that would launch the U.S. into World War II, furious and out for revenge. The aircraft launched from IJN Zuikaku will be something we cover this Sunday, so stay tuned for that. The Japanese were ruthless in the Pacific, especially in the beginning of World War II. For the first time in naval history, aircraft sank a battleship at sea that was fighting back, with the Japanese land-based aircraft sinking HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse. In April of 1942, the Japanese fast carrier strike force ranged into the Indian Ocean and sank many ships, including HMS Hermes. The Doolittle raid in April of 1942 against Tokyo, consisting of 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers launched from USS Hornet, forced the recall of the Japanese strike force to home waters. The world's first carrier battle, and one in which fleets only exchanged blows with aircraft, was a tactical victory for the Japanese, but a strategic win for the Allies, and it was the Battle of the Coral Sea. Another first for the history books was the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway was a naval battle decisively fought by aircraft and not warships. All 4 Japanese carriers engaged were sunk by planes from 3 American air carriers, one of which was sunk. The battle is largely considered the turning point in the war in the Pacific, notably as it was orchestrated by the Japanese to draw out American carriers and ended up backfiring majorly. After this, the number of U.S. aircraft carriers exploded. They built up carrier after carrier with a mixture of fleet, light, and escort carriers, primarily with the illustrious Essex class introduced in 1943. These ships played a major part in winning the Pacific War, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944 was the largest aircraft carrier battle in history and the decisive naval battle of World War II. It was over for the Japanese. They just refused to see it. The long reign of the battleship as the primary component of a fleet came to a close when U.S. carrier-borne aircraft sank the largest battleships ever built, Musashi in 1944 and Yamato in 1945. We have episodes on both if you're interested. The largest aircraft carrier of World War II, Shinano, was a Yamato-class battleship converted at the last minute to be an aircraft carrier in order to counter the disastrous loss of their 4 fleet carriers at Midway. Unfortunately for the Japanese, she too was sunk by USS Archerfish in November of 1944, a nearby patrolling submarine. Following World War II, multiple major developments were made to aircraft carriers to improve operations of jet-powered aircraft. The first was angled flight decks. During World War II, the aircraft landed on the flight deck parallel to the long axis of the ship's hull. Aircraft would then be parked on the deck at the bow end of the flight deck. A crash barrier was raised to stop landing aircraft that had overshot the landing area, and if this happened, it often caused serious damage to the aircraft or injury to the pilot, and if the crash barrier was too weak, destruction of the parked aircraft behind it. The angled flight deck allowed for safer parking of planes in the bow without risking damage to landing aircraft. It was proven a great addition to carriers, and almost all aircraft carriers are built this way moving forward. The second is the steam-powered catapult, powered by steam from the ship's boilers. Invented by Commander C.C. Mitchell of the Royal Navy Reserve, it was widely adopted following trials on HMS Perseus between 1950 and 1952, which showed it to be more powerful and reliable than the hydraulic catapults which were used in the 1940s. And the third development was optical landing systems. This was another British innovation, and it was a gyroscopically controlled concave mirror on the port side of the deck. On either side of the mirror was a line of green datum lights, and a bright orange source of light was directed into the mirror, creating what was called a ball or meatball. This could be seen by the landing aviator, and the position of the ball compared to the datum lights indicated the plane's position relative to the desired glide path. Prior to optical landing systems, pilots relied on visual flag signals from landing signal officers on deck. Moving into the nuclear age, we get into our fourth development. The U.S. Navy attempted to become a strategic nuclear force in parallel with the Air Force Long-Range Bombers project to build USS United States. No, not SS United States, the gorgeous ocean liner, but the supercarrier. However, this project was cancelled, and this delayed the growth of aircraft carriers. Nuclear weapons would be part of the carrier weapons load despite objections by the Air Force. The U.S. Navy would also build the first carrier powered by nuclear reactors, USS Enterprise. She was powered by 8 nuclear reactors and was the second surface warship behind USS Long Beach with nuclear propulsion. Subsequent nuclear supercarriers, starting with USS Nimitz, took advantage of this technology to increase their endurance, utilizing only 2 reactors. Today, many nations utilize nuclear-powered submarines. However, France appears to be the only country left with a nuclear-powered carrier, Charles de Gaulle. Our fifth development was the helicopter and need for the helipad. Helicopters are very versatile. They can be used to transport equipment and personnel, air-to-air combat, air-to-surface combat, and anti-submarine warfare roles with dipping sonar, air-launched torpedoes, and depth charges, as well as for anti-surface vessel warship with anti-ship missiles. Fixed-wing aircraft were best suited for air-to-air combat and air-to-surface combat, so having helicopters really opened up a lot of doors for aircraft carriers. In the late 50s and early 60s, the UK and the US converted some older carriers into helicopter carriers or seagoing helicopter bases like HMS Bulwark. Later on, amphibious assault ships would also have helicopters and Harrier aircraft. Finally, the last innovation to note was the ski jump ramp, which was an alternative to contemporary catapult systems. It was a ramp at the end of a runway or flight deck that allows an aircraft to make a running start to convert part of its forward momentum into upward motion. The idea is that the additional altitude and upward angled flight path from the jump provides extra time until the forward airspeed generated by engine thrust is high enough to maintain level. I'm not a pilot. Any pilots in the comments, please explain and verify further. As for the aircraft carrier, they are still extensively used today and in multiple capacities and for navies all around the world. The US Navy has many aircraft carriers and they are key players in fleets all around the globe. As technology modernizes, so do aircraft and their carriers, vastly standing out next to the beautiful, vintage carriers of World War II. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our World War II Warships playlist in the cards. Stay tuned this Sunday for the sinking of Zuikaku, an Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carrier that participated in Pearl Harbor before meeting her own brutal end. Thank you for tuning into Fast Facts Friday, have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you next time.